It was a chilly morning in the year 1347, when a lord awoke not to the gentle chime of an iPhone, but perhaps to a rooster that sounded suspiciously like it had a personal vendetta. Dawn crept through the arrow-slit windows of the stone keep, casting long, yawning shadows across the rush-covered floor. The castle stirred. Not all at once, no, that would be too efficient. Medieval life was rarely in a hurry. Instead, it yawned and blinked into life, much like you may be doing right now. In the great hall, which always smelled faintly of smoked meat and ambition, the first order of business wasn't diplomacy or defense, but breakfast. Or at least, the medieval attempt at breakfast. And yes, porridge made its entrance. Not the maple and brown sugar variety of today, but something closer to beige wallpaper paste with a hint of onion, and maybe, if you were lucky, a rogue blackberry. This was pottage, a thick stew made of grains, legumes, and whatever the medieval equivalent of odds and ends might be. If oatmeal is a hug in a bowl, then pottage was more like a firm handshake. Yet, it was the cornerstone of countless lives. The peasants ate it, the monks stirred it, and even noblemen dipped a slice of dark, crusty bread into it, with all the pomp of a cheese fondue party. In many homes, pottage might simmer gently over the central hearth all day, with more vegetables, and sometimes regret, added to it as needed. It was eternal, like Grandma's soup pot, or that one candle in your cupboard you only light during power outages. Surprisingly, we still nod to this medieval marvel every time we fire up a slow cooker. That nourishing, everything-in-one-pot philosophy lives on in our chili, our stews, our weekly mixtape dinners, where leftovers meet their destiny. The truth is, our modern kitchens are haunted by helpful medieval traditions, though we've sensibly banished the rats. Back then, of course, meals weren't just about eating. They were rituals, wrapped in custom, carefully seasoned with superstition. The act of breaking bread was quite literal and symbolic. To share bread was to share safety, company, and commiseration about how poorly peas returned one's affections. For the devout, even the shape of a loaf could hint at divinity. Monasteries churned out bread with more pride than IKEA dispatches Allen wrenches. Flour was precious. Bread was local currency. And yes, people traded loaves, praise loaves, and occasionally insulted loaves. Mostly if they were underbaked, overbaked, or so hard they could be used as a weapon. Even today, when we choose rustic sourdough over sterile supermarket slices, we echo a time when bread was earthy, real, and occasionally accompanied by a small stone, which was not ideal for your molars. We owe much to the monks as well, those robed pioneers of fermentation and early food science. In their quiet, sun-dappled kitchens, they developed brewing techniques and refined recipes that would later blossom into European culinary traditions. Had it not been for these gentle gastronomes, your favorite sandwich might still be served on a very suspicious piece of bark. Let's not forget the medieval calendar either, which dictated diets with the precision of a temperamental nutritionist. Religious fasting days weren't an occasional trend. They were common, bordering on constant. That meant no meat on Fridays, or for upward of 150 days a year, depending on your level of devotion or medieval guilt. Fish markets did well, and eel, surprisingly, was the kale of its day. Slimy, slippery, and inexplicably fashionable. Even the way today's meals are timed has faint echoes from this period. The early dinner or supper tradition comes from a time when daylight wasn't optional, it was everything. You ate early because candles were expensive, fire was fickle, and nobody wanted to wrestle a goose in the dark. all of this points to a curious truth. While we may have traded mead for lattes and castle gates for kitchen doors, the foundations of our food habits are still built on medieval stones, perhaps not carved by hand, but gently simmered, salted, and sometimes spooned out with a weary grin. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest your head and let time soften around the edges as another quiet corner of history waits, just like an old pot of pottage, warming on the embers. By the flickering flame of a beeswax candle, a medieval kitchen awakens, not with the clang of metal or the battle cry of some knight, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of bread dough being kneaded by hands that have seen frost and fire, war and wedding feasts. Welcome to the heart of the home in the Middle Ages. Not the great hall or the chapel, but the kitchen. Slightly smoky, often slightly chaotic, and absolutely bursting at the seams with herbs you've mostly forgotten exist. Before we tuck ourselves into the soft, oat-filled blankets of ancient recipes, let's take a moment to meet the unsung heroes of the era. Not kings or popes or ambitious jesters, but the cooks. Usually illiterate, sometimes intoxicated, and always underpaid. These culinary conjurers were somehow expected to turn roots, grains, and the occasional pigeon into something resembling a meal, and preferably one that didn't accidentally poison anyone important. What you ate in the Middle Ages, of course, had everything to do with your social status. If you were a peasant, dinner meant pottage, a thick steaming stew of whatever you didn't mind boiling for 5 hours. Turnips, lentils, cabbage, leftover cabbage, someone's lost carrot, and, if you were feeling particularly rebellious, a pinch of stale bacon or a bone rumoured to have once belonged to something edible. Add a crusty wheel of coarse barley bread on the side, and voila, you had what passed for culinary luxury among the working folk. It may not sound like much, but don't scoff too lightly. That same pottage kept entire villages alive through long wool-wearing winters, and the bread, dense and sturdy, sometimes doubling as dinnerware, was the medieval multitasker, long before anyone invented the spork. Now, if you were lucky enough to be born title adjacent, say, someone with a von, or at least a few sheep, things got a little more interesting at mealtime. The upper classes, ever eager to demonstrate their wealth and excellent dental insurance, had access to spices. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and saffron. That tempting yellow powder that still costs more per gram than curiosity itself. Spices didn't just flavor the food, they screamed, "Look at me, I can afford to import things." In fact, wealthy households tossed spices into nearly everything, up to and including wine, pies, and the occasional fish dish that had clearly been dead for questionable quantities of time. Spoons were optional. Social status was not. It's worth noting that most medieval cooks, whether peasant or posh, worked like caffeinated alchemists, inventive, practical, and only occasionally flammable. They believed food had humours not in the ha-ha sense, but the bodily fluid energy kind, cold and moist, hot and dry. Every ingredient had a personality, a temperament, and an ideal pairing, like matchmaking, but with leeks and gooseberries. Meanwhile, if you were to wander outside the kitchen, you'd find the dining space, a cross between a dinner party and a power move. In noble households, the Great Hall was center stage for meals that could last hours, complete with entertainment, excessive meat, and someone whose job title may have genuinely been turnip bearer. The Lord sat at the top table, accompanied by other important-sounding individuals with beards shaped by conviction and poor grooming tools. Below them were lower tables, descending in rank until you reached the household staff, or whoever lost that week's political squabble. The concept of assigned seating was invented largely to avoid sword fights over stew. Funny thing is, even with all the ostentation and roasted peacock, there were rules, a sort of medieval table etiquette. You didn't just pick up a leg of boar and gnaw at it like a character in a low-budget fantasy show. Knives were often communal. Salt was a privilege, placed strategically closer to the important people. And hands were washed before meals, a surprisingly sensible detail considering the state of everything else. Clean hands, dirty everything else. That's the medieval way. But perhaps the most charming thread through it all is how so many of these customs have danced their way into our modern lives, quietly disguised behind casseroles and Sunday roasts. Today's dinners may no longer depend on serfs or saffron smugglers, but the echoes of those smoky kitchens and herb-strewn tables remain. Even now, when we cut bread at the table, or argue over seating arrangements at weddings, or judge someone silently for misusing a spoon, we're just playing out history's most delicious rerun. And as the fire crackles quietly low, beneath a bubbling pot, and beside a shelf of thyme and mystery powders, the night hums with the soft steam of simmered tradition. Tomorrow, we'll step even closer into the daily flavour of medieval life, not in the dining halls of dukes or the cauldrons of cooks, but among the streets where honey met ale and superstition stirred the soup. In the medieval mind, bread was less a side dish and more a lifestyle. Floury, crusty, and sometimes questionably chewy, bread was the very foundation, both figuratively and occasionally literally, of every meal. If you were to wander into a feasting hall around the 12th century, your first impression might be of elbows, ale, and a thick smell of mutton. But within that chaotic revelry sat the unsung hero of the medieval meal, the trencher. Now, I know what you're thinking. A trencher sounds suspiciously like a sword or an Elizabethan insult. But no, a trencher in medieval cuisine was essentially a crusty, roundish slab of yesterday's bread, repurposed by the ever-resourceful to act as a dinner plate. Imagine that, dining on your dinner, and then, if your hunger overshadows your dignity, mildly gnawing on the dish it came on. It was humble, it was handy, and it soaked up gravy like a blessed sponge of gluten. And if you were a lord or lady, or simply someone with more teeth than patience, you wouldn't necessarily eat the trencher. Instead, after the meal, the gravy-soaked trenchers often went straight to peasants or the poor. Charity, in the form of someone else's lukewarm sausage dribblings. A noble gesture, depending on your perspective, or your appetite. Bread itself was political. The whiter the bread, the higher the status. Fine, pale loaves made from sifted wheat were reserved for the wealthy, while the lower classes made do with coarse, dark loaves packed with barley, oats, or, in particularly bad harvest years, whatever wasn't nailed down. Beans, acorns, ground peas, and a suspenseful collection of weeds. It was hearty, yes, but also functionally indistinguishable from a roof tile. Yet bread's importance extended far beyond the dining table. In many towns, bakeries were one of the first services regulated by law. The assize of bread, a real, delightfully named English statute, first introduced in 1266, set official standards for bread size, price, and quality. This wasn't just to protect consumers. It also helped manage grain supplies and prevent the kind of civil unrest that tends to bubble up when your breakfast turns into sawdust. Bakers were watched carefully. Too much air in your loaf, and you might be punished. Too little weight, and you'd find yourself in the stocks, or worse, subjected to the dreaded pillory of bread fraud, which sounds delicious, but was famously not. So naturally, many bakers developed an ingenious habit of tossing in an extra roll or slice to avoid shortchanging anyone. This bonus loaf, you've probably heard of it. We still call it the baker's dozen, 12 for you and 1 extra to stay out of trouble. And if you think that dusty old medieval bread oven could never have touched your modern kitchen, just consider your toaster. What is a toaster really, but a tiny electric version of the massive wood-fired ovens once built against stone walls with enough room inside to roast a peasant? Don't try that at home. But yes, today's impersonal, slightly resentful kitchen appliances owe a great deal to the roaring, smoke-belching fixtures of medieval baking life. Of course, it wasn't all grim chewing and mandated loaves. In market towns, you'd occasionally find pantries and cookshops offering subtle variations on bread, honey-drenched rolls, or pain perdue, bread soaked in sweet-spiced wine and fried sort of like medieval French toast. If the French toast in question wore a wool cloak and possibly carried a sword. There were also bread puddings, thickened with eggs and dried fruit, though medieval raisins often included added volunteer stems and occasional beetle extras, protein, if you're feeling generous. Even at monasteries, where silence reigned and stomachs grumbled, bread took center stage. Monks baked their own loaves, often of a rugged, nutritional persuasion. And when they dipped these slices into herbal broths at dawn, they may have been the original inventors of artisanal brunch. It wasn't exactly avocado toast, but given the absence of avocados and the blessed silence of the scriptorium, it was probably better for digestion. As the candlelight flickers low across the feasting hall of our imagination, we leave behind the humble breadbasket of history, slightly crusty, slightly holy, and still haunting our pantries today. Ahead lies the pungent trail of something else, something sharp on the tongue, crushed in wooden mortars by mysterious kitchen hands. Yes, next we gently follow the scent of medieval spices. Across the murmuring English countryside, somewhere between the damp stone of castle kitchens and the slightly more optimistic pantry of a merchant's townhouse, there lived one of the anonymous champions of medieval cuisine, the pottage. Not quite soup, not entirely stew, and never entirely the same twice. It simmered its way through centuries of European history like a loyal background character, humble, often overlooked, but always there when you needed it. To really understand the pottage's place among the taste buds of history, one must picture a massive, soot-darkened cauldron, equal parts sustenance and suspense, swinging gently over a glowing hearth. This cauldron rarely got a break. Inside it bubbled an ever-evolving concoction, changed daily, sometimes hourly, by whatever the cook could find. A bit of barley, a scrap of mutton too mysterious to identify, maybe yesterday's turnip if it hadn't entirely gone rogue. In a way, it was the fridge clean-out stew of the Middle Ages. Except replace fridge with root cellar and clean-out with this had better not go to waste because we won't see eggs until Michaelmas. Nobles, merchants, and peasants alike all partook in forms of this one-pot wonder. The primary difference was that the aristocratic pottage had significantly fancier guests at the party, imported spices, possibly a poached quail's egg, and at least one ingredient that had no proper English name. Meanwhile, the average peasant's pottage might have given itself a pep talk to convince the villagers that eating it again for the third time in a row wasn't that bad. It was economical, filling, and generally safe. Unless someone got overambitious with the wild mushrooms, and then, well, the pottage became a bit more hallucinatory. This slow, bubbling stew tells us more than just what people ate. It hints at how people lived. Food waste today is measured in leftover pizza and neglected parsley. In a medieval household, not throwing food away was not a virtue. It was survival. Bones were boiled until the spirit of the chicken had fully moved on. Cabbage stumps, fish heads, and onion skins found their place in the pot, contributing to a broth that was fervently cheered on by peasants and quietly judged by monks. Of course, irony has a long shelf life, and here's a bit. In modern times, we've repackaged this culinary catch-all and given it a glamorous alter ego, bone broth. Served in minimalist mugs at delicately overpriced cafes and enthusiastically dissected by wellness influencers named Sage or Kale. Bone broth walks the same path that medieval pottage once did, except now it's filtered through a $12 price tag and the drumming chants of coconut lifestyle blogs. But the cauldron wasn't merely kitchen equipment. It was a communal hearth, often simmering all day. Children were raised on the scent of bubbling barley, and travelers arriving during a rainstorm could be warmed by a ladle of this democratic dish. It didn't discriminate by class, as long as you were welcome at the fire. The longer you let the pottage cook, the deeper the flavors became. Cookbooks of the period, if one was so lucky to be literate and own a book that didn't double as fire starter, would sometimes mention the need to let it draw, which, despite sounding poetic, just meant cook it until you're absolutely sure it's not going to kill you. And yes, even the pottage had etiquette. In wealthier homes, the servant dishing out the stew might diligently avoid letting the wealth-curdling peasant bits rise to the surface of the noble's bowl. A courtly pottage was sometimes served in a hollowed-out bread trencher, eaten only once the juices had seeped luxuriously into the crust. A poor man's trencher, possibly a wooden bowl, or if it was a lean year, half a hollowed turnip. It's rather comforting in its way. The idea that through all of history's wars, plagues, and extremely sharp bread knives, people still gathered round pots and shared meals made from what was available. The pottage was democracy with a ladle. Everyone got some, and no one really complained, at least not to the cook. And though we may not hover over a hearth while stirring a bubbling kettle with a spoon carved from last year's failed fence post, the ritual survives in our modern-day stews, chili pots, and whatever mystery concoction you've slow-cooked on a Sunday. The concept of throwing everything in, letting it simmer, and then sharing it together, it's ancient, but it still lives in us. Like most good things in medieval life, the pottage was made better by bread, which, conveniently, brings us to a curious tale about loaves, legends, and why bakers used to be legally required to give you extra. A medieval morning in the castle kitchens began not with a rooster's crow, though plenty of those feathered alarm clocks made their enthusiastic contributions, but with the sound of bread. Yes, bread. Or rather, the scraping of dough against wooden paddles, the low grumble of bakers in wool tunics questioning life choices, and the steady thud of flour sacks being hoisted about. Bread was the edible foundation of daily medieval life, so fundamental that to not eat bread was, in some cases, almost suspicious. Were you fasting? Were you cursed? Were you perhaps French? Just a bit of pan-regional teasing. Regardless, no other food bore so much symbolic and literal weight. And like all great historical essentials, it came in many forms, and equally many grudges. Not all breads were created equal in the Middle Ages. The whitest, fluffiest, most refined loaves were reserved for the nobility, who preferred their grains thoroughly sifted and their digestive tracts minimally engaged. These soft breads, known as manchette, were made from fine wheat flour and served warm if you were important, and cold if either your kitchen was inefficient or your social rank politely suggested you wait your turn. At the other end of the spectrum lay the dense, rugged, tooth-resistant loaves made of rye, barley, or oats, staple fare for peasants, monks, and anyone whose dental plan consisted mostly of prayer. Sometimes this bread, when stale enough, pulled double duty as a plate. These were called trenchers, thick hunks of bread often used as edible dishes. Imagine eating your stew directly off a mashed-up wheat coaster, and then eating the coaster. That's trenchers for you. Medieval snack plates with the structural integrity of an undercooked doormat. Eventually, once the liquid soaked in properly, trenchers became passable meals, though, depending on the stew, they could also become regrettable architectural experiments. After all, stew over soggy bread will only support so much vertical ambition. Best to eat quickly and lean not heavily. But even bread had its controversies. In some towns, bakers were legally required to give customers a little extra loaf. This was known as the baker's dozen, where bakers threw in a 13th loaf for every dozen. Not from generosity, but to avoid being flogged for shortchanging. Medieval punishment was thorough and rarely subtle. No room for, oops, I'm a loaf short. You risked cuffs, stocks, or public shaming. A nightmare scenario for someone whose greatest crime was underestimating yeast's swell. Yeast itself was something of an arcane mystery back then. No one really understood fermentation, so when a loaf rose beautifully, it was considered little short of sorcery, or, in more cheerful kitchens, divine favor. Very few people suspected a microbe was at work. Instead, sourdough starters were passed down like family heirlooms, treated with nearly the reverence of holy relics. One false move, and the family bread blob could go bad, betray you, or grow an unpleasant attitude. Much like a cat, really, but bubbly. In grander halls, especially those with their own bakehouses, bread was produced in enormous quantities, sometimes dozens or hundreds of loaves a day to keep the noble household and its retinue satisfied. Servants, stable hands, guards, stewards, jesters pretending not to sneak seconds, all were fueled largely by bread. Alongside ale, it was the safest thing to consume. Water, you see, was often questionable, but heated grain-based beverages were another story. The medieval motto might as well have been beer, because it's probably not full of worms. Interestingly, the rhythm of bread baking echoed a kind of quiet diplomacy between classes, especially in manors where surplus loaves went to the poor. It wasn't quite charity, nor was it entirely utility. More like the edible equivalent of please don't revolt, here's some carbohydrates. Whether it was enough to keep the peace is debatable, but no one threw stale rolls with kindness. Still, the humble loaf, whether as trenchers, table bread, or symbolic tokens, endures as one of the most lasting legacies of medieval dining. Consider, next time you butter a slice of toast, or awkwardly smile at a colleague while chewing through a bagel, that you are taking part in a centuries-old tradition, one built on flour, fire, and the mild fear of being publicly flogged for underbaking. Now, with the scent of warm crust drifting faintly through the stone halls of our sleepy memory, let's wander onward, past the bread ovens and toward the sweet allure of medieval desserts. Because yes, they had sugar, sort of, long before the days of fork anxiety at stiff dinner parties, Medieval diners made peace with a much more elementary approach. They used their hands. And yes, that's with all the confidence of someone who believed bathing was seasonal at best. But before you judge, know that there was actually a deeply structured etiquette to eating with fingers. Just, well, fewer utensils to enforce it. Picture it. A grand banquet hall, echoing with lute music, illuminated by flickering torchlight that casts every roast goose in a flattering glow. The table is draped in linen, but instead of plates, there are hefty slabs of stale bread called trenchers. Not meant for chewing. No, these were the medieval equivalent of edible crockery. Drenched in gravy, greased by roast drippings, and finally, if the nobles were feeling generous, tossed to the poor or the dogs after the meal. Not exactly dishwasher safe, but infinitely biodegradable. And what of the hands? Oh, they were the star cutlery. The right hand did most of the culinary heavy lifting, particularly in Christian Europe, where the left was reserved for less appetizing tasks. So if you were a lefty, tough luck. That roast quail better submit to a right-handed grip, or else. But meals weren't chaos. There were codes, you see. Well-bred diners would wash their hands before meals, sometimes more than once. And in high society, courteous eating was a mark of nobility. Scooping stew with your fingers, acceptable. Licking them afterward, only if you did it with the kind of restraint Shakespeare might have called dainty. Napkins were uncommon, so fingers often doubled as both fork and sponge. It was, paradoxically, a greasy ballet of table manners and meat juice. Still, it wasn't all savory slurping. From the 11th century onward, people began flirting with forks, tentatively, suspiciously, and in some places, downright judgmentally. When a Byzantine princess used a two-tined golden fork in 1004 in Venice, people were horrified. The clergy decried it as decadent. God gave us fingers, they protested. Why mock his wisdom with tiny metal tridents? Forks were considered effeminate, foreign, even heretical. Honestly, you had to admire the commitment to finger dining. Spoons were useful for soups and porridges, of course, and knives for portioning meat. But forks? They were that suspicious new relative no one quite trusted at the family reunion. It wasn't until centuries later, around the 17th century, that forks finally carved their place at the Western table for good. But the medieval table wasn't merely about physical tools. It was about ceremony and roles. If you were a guest at a noble feast, you'd be seated according to your social rank. The closer to the Lord, the better the food. Those down the bench might find themselves stuck with pottage that could politely be described as economical. Oddly enough, communal dining wasn't much for privacy either. People often shared a cup and even the same trencher, which, again, was made of week-old bread. By our standards, a medieval meal was a curious mix of intimacy and hierarchy, like if BYOB potlucks were curated with Game of Thrones seating charts. And what about seasoning, you ask, half-snuggled and mid-yawn? Contrary to the popular myth, medieval cooks did not use spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat. That's pure Tudor-era slander. In fact, spices were outrageously expensive. Pepper, saffron, cloves, and cinnamon could cost more than some servants made in a year. People didn't waste them on iffy ham. They prized them, measured them, and displayed them proudly, often locked in little boxes like edible treasure. Using spices was less about masking rot and more about flaunting wealth. It was the culinary equivalent of wearing a crown to brunch. So imagine this: a shimmering medieval feast, trenchers softening under heaps of venison, spices perfuming the air with exotic promise. gloved minstrels plucking tunes that drift like breadcrumbs through the rafters. Hands delicately greasy, diners raising cups, not forks to their lips. And much like your dinner parties today, someone at the table is probably wondering why Martha insists on bringing her chutney again. Some things, after all, never change. Now, as the fire in our imaginary hall dwindles to embers and the smell of roast boar fades into memory, let us turn our attention to the humble heroes beyond the feast. The cooks, those soot-dusted culinary alchemists behind the scenes. As a foggy dawn stretched its way across the mossy rooftops of a sleepy medieval village, an important ritual was already underway. Not a coronation, nor a joust, nor even a poetic argument about who invented cheese first, though all three were beloved pastimes. No, this particular morning heralded the quiet, noble ceremony that has endured through the centuries, the breaking of fast. And yes, this is where we get the word breakfast, just in case linguistic time travel is your favorite type. Now, much about medieval life was harsh. Winters were long, soap was suspicious, and shoes were more of a concept than a comfort. But when it came to the first meal of the day, there was surprising variety, depending, of course, on the size of your purse or the title in front of your name. Let us begin with the peasantry, those humble heroes of mud and millet. Their mornings began with the rising sun, or more often, well before it. After all, the rooster didn't crow to announce your meal. It crowed to remind you that 12 hours of ploughing, threshing, or sheep staring awaited. Breakfast was simple and strictly practical. Leftover pottage from the night before, a thick vegetable stew that could plausibly sit on the hearth for several days without anyone asking too many questions. A chunk of coarse rye bread dunked into the stew to soften the teeth's workload, and on special occasions, perhaps a slice of cheese so sturdy it qualified as both food and furniture. Drinks? Water was not always reliable, thanks to medieval plumbing being little more than optimism with a bucket. So weak ale was the drink of choice, even for breakfast. Don't think of it as boozy indulgence. Think of it as oat-flavored hydration with a hint of existential dread. In the manor houses and castles, however, breakfast lived a very different life. The upper classes debated whether it was even necessary. In fact, for a time, eating in the morning was considered suspiciously indulgent, almost sinful. Monks especially were urged to delay their first meal until after morning prayers. Sunrise was just too decadent a time to chew. But eventually, grumbling stomachs won out over spiritual decorum. And when nobles did deign to eat in the morning, they did so dramatically. A rich man's breakfast might include white bread, sifted and fine enough to alarm a modern nutritionist, alongside cold meats, eggs, and yes, the ever-important honey. Because nothing says, "I own a moat," like a slab of roasted lamb drizzled in sugar and bee affection. Eggs played a surprisingly central role in morning fare across classes. From soft-boiled in cracked earthenware bowls to scrambled with young herbs and aged dairy, they were the medieval MVP of breakfast versatility. Chickens weren't just pest control with feathers. They were breakfast factories with attitude. Not to be outdone, fish made their aquatic debut at dawn as well. Pickled herring, smoked eels, even salted cod. If it could be caught and preserved, it could be turned into breakfast. Of course, the smell may have caused other senses to momentarily leave the body, but such was the price of early seafood enthusiasm. One curious note: medieval people loved their spices, even the humblest breakfast when possible. bore the faintest whisper of cinnamon, cloves, or black pepper. These were expensive, yes, but when used sparingly, 5 specks of nutmeg could make even the most questionable porridge taste like a royal decree. Sweetness, while usually reserved for the very well-off, crept into breakfast now and again. Tarts with dried fruits, honeyed pastries, and in rare cases, candied ginger snuck their way onto wooden tables, eliciting choir-worthy sighs from those lucky enough to afford them. Sugar was a status symbol, like a medieval Rolex, but stickier. And so, with full bellies, or at least full hopes for a next meal, people wandered into their day. The similarities to our modern breakfasts may not leap off the plate, but echoes remain. The warmth of morning bread, the comfort of eggs, the soothing ritual of something hot to drink before we face the wrangling of whatever day it is. As the hearth's glow softened in the morning mist, and chickens muttered gossip to one another in the yard, somewhere not too far away, a pot began to boil. It wasn't breakfast this time, no. It was something deeper, darker, and, believe it or not, even more transformative. Because dinner might be social, and breakfast might be practical. But soup was where medieval hearts went to feel something. Let's stir into that pot next. As evening shadows stretch across the kitchen gardens of a long crumbled manor, we find ourselves wandering barefoot along the humble rows of leeks and cabbages. Vegetables so ordinary their names have barely changed since Norman boots squelched in these very soils. And in this gentle scene, where night begins to hum softly over herbs and hearthstones, we arrive at a rather surprising revelation in the dusty annals of medieval food lore. The enduring, leafy legacy of the salad. Yes, salad. The very item you nervously poke at during office luncheons or heroically attempt to meal prep with mediocre lettuce from the fridge, lest you assume it a modern health fad foisted upon us by kale enthusiasts and quinoa influencers. Allow yourself the comfort of knowing that salads are possibly one of the oldest, simplest, and most persistently misunderstood joys of the dining table. The word itself comes from the Latin salata, meaning salted, a nod to the Roman practice of dressing raw vegetables with brine. Fast forward to our medieval kitchens, and this humble concoction of chopped greens, herbs, and oddly aggressive splashes of vinegar was a staple on noble and peasant tables alike. They called them salads in old cookbooks, which sounds rather like a Shakespearean insult, but was in fact a mark of culinary refinement. Now, not all medieval salads were, shall we say, digestively forgiving. Some included marigolds, violets, and dandelion leaves, as visually appealing as they were possibly sneeze-inducing. Others mingled mint, onions, garlic, and all manners of sharply voiced greenery, and always with oils and vinegars strong enough to singe a nasal hair. These salads were seen not merely as sides, but as medicinal marvels, designed to cool the humours and open the pipes, which are historical euphemisms for, well, we'll delicately say digestion and move on. But here's the charming secret slipping between cabbage leaves. The medieval salad wasn't served as a polite appetizer before the meal. It often came in between courses, or even at the end. Picture finishing your meal of roast goose and honeyed parsnips, and just as you lean back to unlace your hose and contemplate a post-dinner nap, in comes a bowl of bitter greens with vinegar sharp enough to strip paint. Why? Because dinner was believed to dampen the stomach's fires, and a salad would reignite the metabolic forge. Or perhaps they just really liked vinegar. We shouldn't judge. They had far fewer condiments to work with. Salads were also a chance for table theatrics. Medieval diners loved a bit of drama. which is honestly quite relatable. Imagine bowls arranged with floral precision, colours layered like tapestries, reds of beetroot and apple, the emerald of parsley, scattered petals floating like summer dreams over a bed of lettuce picked that morning. If Pinterest had existed in the 14th century, a salad with marigold blossoms would definitely have gone viral. It wasn't just what was in the salad, it was how it was tossed. By the 15th century, upper-class tables would sometimes feature salad dressers or salad makers, whose job was to assemble and flavour these leafy marvels. Picture a man in a fine, if slightly oil-stained tunic, leaning over a wooden bowl with serious concentration, drizzling verjuice, a sour grape juice used before lemons were common, and muttering prayers to Saint Lettuce of Romaine. Saint Lettuce doesn't actually exist, but wouldn't he make an excellent mascot for a farmer's market? And on the subject of lettuce, it wasn't always the noble staple we imagine. Medieval varieties were sometimes tougher, more bitter, and occasionally riddled with snails who frankly had no plans of moving that day. Washing was advised, but inconsistently performed. Thus, a certain crunch might unexpectedly accompany your vinaigrette, a sort of surprise protein, medieval edition. Still, even with occasional invertebrate interlopers, the practice of eating raw greens, lovingly dressed and artfully arranged, endured. It drifted across centuries and empires, from monastic gardens to Parisian cafes, finally reaching into modern lunchboxes, where homemade vinaigrette now awaits its moment of fridge-induced separation. And so, as we brush the last speck of pepper from our lips and leave the imaginary banquet behind, we carry with us the comforting thought that even in a world of castles, crusades, and questionable dental hygiene, someone still took the time to arrange a bunch of herbs in a bowl and call it art. Ahead, beyond the seasoned leaves and aromatic oils, we wander toward another toothsome delight, one that crackles, crumbles, and perhaps even puffs, if you're lucky. But that, as always, is best left for the next course. As the cool moonlight tiptoed across the stone floors of a medieval kitchen, illuminating baskets of root vegetables and clusters of hanging herbs like a spotlight on unsuspecting extras, another humble ingredient quietly emerged from the wings of history to command a standing ovation. The egg. Yes, the humble egg. Round, unassuming, often sticky in unexpected moments, but undeniably eternal. While it may not possess the glamour of a roast swan or the mystique of a truffle foraged by a particularly ambitious pig, the egg was, and remains, a quiet cornerstone of cuisine, nestled comfortably between the cradle of myth and the frying pan of practicality. In medieval Europe, eggs were more than just food. They were deeply symbolic, representing rebirth, purity, and the miracle of chickens laying what are essentially pre-birds wrapped in their own ceramic packaging. Monks, ever the poetic crowd, considered eggs little orbs of divine potential, probably because they were cheap, endlessly versatile, and didn't cluck at the abbot during morning prayers. On Lenten days of fasting, when meat dared not pass one's lips, and the clergy had a firm grip on moral supper choices, eggs often got lumped into the same sinful category as bacon and good cheer. But the rulebook varied from parish to parish, and many nobles, ever clever with loopholes, simply made sure their kitchens were strategically unobserved during Lent. Curious how often egg custard rhymes with confession. Still, the egg found its way into most medieval feasts, whipped into pastries, folded into sauces, and served boiled next to a slab of pottage or a questionable sausage. Boiled eggs were often presented sliced and arranged in elaborate designs, sometimes dyed with beetroot or saffron, to impress the sort of guest who noticed those things before noticing they'd left their dagger in the cloakroom. Interestingly, the egg code of culinary conduct also included how one cracked them, because of course this mattered. It was said that cracking an egg on the narrow end would invite misfortune, which, given the overall state of hygiene and dental care at the time, really wasn't a risk worth taking. The superstition was so sticky, it lingered well into modern times, and if you still crack your egg on the countertop, a move medieval cooks would have found suspiciously avant-garde, then you're part of a long, cracked lip tradition. But perhaps what's most delightful is the tale of the egg's relatives, custards, tarts, and the incredibly ambitious omelette types who dreamt of being soufflés before the invention of French. Egg-based flans were popular, often sweetened with honey and flavoured with rosewater or ground almonds. To modern taste buds, these might seem like perfume pudding, but to a medieval tongue, they were the stuff of courtly poems and mildly alarming menu translations. The most iconic of these egg inventions was none other than the humble quiche ancestor, a mixture of eggs and cream baked in a pastry casing, seasoned with herbs and whatever meat or cheese hadn't run off yet. Medieval cookery books overflowed with such concoctions, their parchment pages bearing proud grease stains of centuries past. Interestingly, those same cookbooks tended to measure ingredient quantities with a poetic vagueness that made every meal an intimate collaboration with the divine, or an enthusiastic accident. A typical recipe might read, "Take a few eggs, a handful of grated cheese, and sufficient cream as shall please thee." Ah yes, the ancient art of guessing. Of course, collecting the eggs was its own morning adventure. Chickens in the Middle Ages were more independent than their modern descendants. They roamed free, scratching up gardens and laying their eggs in every conceivable spot except the nest box provided. Children were often dispatched on daily egg quests, scampering through barn, field, and the occasional unwitting laundry pile in search of breakfast. These brave foragers, part farmer, part sleuth, probably deserve a holiday of their own. And so the egg, base of custards, backbone of baking, protein-packed portable snack, carried itself softly through the centuries, cloaked in superstition, culinary genius, and more than a few straw baskets. It remained a staple through revolutions, rebrandings, and the rather unfortunate decades where everything was aspic. Tonight, the comforting legacy of eggs carries on in omelettes and soufflés, brownies and lemon curds, Scotch eggs and meringue-topped pies. All thanks to those early cooks, yolks under their nails, quietly reshaping the foundation of food one crack at a time. And just beyond the shell-thin veil of chapter's end, someone is stirring a pot full of something heartier, bubbling and rich, with the unmistakable aroma of onions stewing in secrets. Let's drift toward the next dish, warm and simmering in shadow. At the heart of any medieval feast, even before the roasted boars and trenchers of bread, even long before Aunt Mildred's infamous turnip and eel pie, came the unassuming miracle of salt. Yes, salt, the crystalline seasoning currently ignored on your kitchen counter, while you reach for chili flakes and Himalayan pink nonsense. But back in the Middle Ages, salt was no humble shaker filler. It was prestige, preservation, and power, all packed neatly into little white sparkles. In fact, "worth your salt" wasn't just a folksy phrase your great-uncle muttered after assembling IKEA furniture. During medieval times, salt was currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations, hence the word salary. So technically, Your paycheck owes its existence to ancient condiments. Salt determined who you were at the table, literally and socially. In grand feasting halls, those drafty stone barns of buttered hierarchy, guests were seated either above or below the salt. The salt cellar, an elaborate vessel often shaped like castles, dragons, or occasionally pineapples with delusions of grandeur, marked the social divide. Nobles and VIPs perched above the salt, closest to the lord of the manor and the choicest morsels. The less fortunate, such as messengers, tradesmen, or musicians, who were just trying their best, found themselves below the salt, grateful if they got a spoon and a boiled cabbage leaf. This tiny mineral wielded such importance because it didn't just season your pottage, it saved your supper. Refrigeration, you see, was just a windy hillside and a prayer. Preserving meat involved a process less stick it in the freezer, and more rub the daylights out of it with rock crystals until it surrenders. Salt drew moisture, fended off bacteria, and transformed your venison haunch into something vaguely edible 6 months later when snow blanketed everything, including your dinner plans. Salt cod, for example, became a staple throughout Europe, especially in Catholic countries, where meat was forbidden on Fridays and approximately 143 other holy days. The Scandinavian version, dried until it reached a consistency somewhere between parquet flooring and academic tenacity, was shipped across seas, soaked back to life, and then simmered into stews that no one questioned too closely. And let us not forget the salt trade itself, an elaborate, slow-bubbling economy that marched caravans across continents. In West Africa, gold and salt were so equally treasured that they traded pound for pound. Salt roads, real ones, not metaphorical highways of ambition, crisscrossed Europe, allowing cities like Salzburg, literally Salt Castle, which sounds like a whimsical Netflix series, to gain wealth and salted prominence. Now, why does all this ancient savory business still echo in your kitchen today? Because every time you reach for salt, not fancy finishing flakes or truffle-infused experiments, but plain, reliable table salt, you're mimicking centuries of culinary instinct. You're participating in the oldest seasoning ceremony known to human taste buds. You're carrying on a tradition where a humble mineral danced between the realms of the sacred, the scientific, and the slightly too salty stew. Even our modern love affair with pickling, resurrected by foodies and weekend vinegar aficionados, owes itself to medieval salting methods. Those briny gherkins and daring kimchi jars. Medieval monks would have called them divine, after blessing them, of course. Yet, despite all this reverence, salt could be deeply mischievous too. Noble households, especially in Italy and France, exchanged salt cellars as wedding gifts, dowry items, and sometimes declarations of polite disdain. An ugly salt cellar was a declaration of blandness, a way of saying, "We came to your banquet, but we noticed your mutton was dry." In the 15th century, losing your salt cellar was tantamount to social ruin. You might as well have served parsnips without pepper, or told the jester his shoes weren't funny. Thus, cellars were locked away, keys kept on velvet chains, entrusted only to the steward, or the butler. Yes, the butler, who originally was not a bored tuxedo wearer, but the person in charge of butter, pantry, and salty triage. So the next time you season your midnight snack, or idly twist sea salt over fries while pretending it's beneficial, remember the weight carried in that pinch. You're dining with dukes, feasting with friars, echoing with every grain the legacy of centuries that saw salt not merely as food, but as fate. And as we waft gently into the flickering candlelight of what came next, picture this. a spoon carved from bone, a table strewn with herbs, and a peculiar green sauce that attempted to conquer everything from roast goose to boredom. Yes, sauces are stirring. As twilight softened the outlines of the medieval world, and torchlight flickered off stone walls like sleepy fireflies, we find ourselves drawn toward a most unassuming hero of the kitchen battlefield, the humble wooden spoon. Now, before you raise an eyebrow too dramatically, let's slow things down. Your pillow is fluffed, your eyes may be half-lidded, and this story will move no faster than a ladle slowly circling a simmering pot of lentils. The wooden spoon, now a modest drawer dweller beside your potato peeler, was once the undisputed scepter of the medieval cook. It stirred, scooped, scraped, and yes, occasionally scolded. In some households, it doubled as a disciplinary device, reinforcing the harsh medieval code of "thou shalt not swipe a second honey biscuit." But beyond its fearsome swishing in children's direction, the spoon was a culinary cornerstone. Iron was too precious in many homes to be wasted on something as mundane as stirring gruel. Wooden spoons were safer, gentler on pots, and didn't transfer heat quite as enthusiastically as their metal cousins, useful, humble, and wonderfully quiet. The monks would have approved. And let us not forget size. Medieval spoons came in sizes that would make your average soup ladle feel self-conscious. Some were well over a foot long, perfect for reaching into the cauldron without singeing one's eyebrows, or getting too close to the suspiciously bubbling contents of a pot labeled herbal remedy. Interestingly, the shape of the spoon could speak volumes about the dish, the region, or even who held power in the kitchen hierarchy. Pointed spoons were better for broths and thin porridges, while rounder ones served as all-purpose tools for thick stews, or whatever could be scraped from the bottom of a pot that had seen better days and a less distracted cook. But wooden spoons were not solitary figures. No, they shared the table with their flashier companions, spices. And here's where things get truly dreamlike. Imagine flavor, traveling thousands of miles across deserts and mountains, bearing the fragrance of distant lands, only to end up in a pot of barley slop on a brisk Wednesday evening. The spice trade was the original odyssey of taste. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, evocative names that today escape in fragrant clouds from muffins and scented candles, once demanded dangerous voyages and enough gold to build a modest moat. Medieval cuisine treated spices not merely as flavor enhancers, but as medicinal miracles. Nutmeg for digestion, pepper for warmth. And if nothing else worked, a bit of ginger could be hoped to realign your humors. Feeling melancholic? More cloves. Plagued by bodily dampness? Try cumin. Was it effective? Historians have questions, but it made the gruel less gruelish, and that, dear dreamer, is victory enough. For nobles, being intensely spiced was a culinary declaration of wealth. It said, "We have tiered gardens and illuminated manuscripts, and also, our mutton has paprika, peasant." For the lower classes, a single cracked peppercorn was practically an event, sometimes even lent from neighbor to neighbor like a prized reliquary of flavor. And how did one measure these precious powders? Why, with dainty wooden scoops, carved by moonlit hands, or hastily whittled from firewood, depending on your budget. It all comes back to wood, doesn't it? Spoons were heirlooms, carried across marriages, down through generations, worn smooth by countless pots, and perhaps the occasional backswat. Think of the silent history in a single spoon. Every recipe it stirred, every sigh it accompanied, and every moment of quiet between bites. Even today, nestled in your drawer among silicone tongs and steel spatulas, that old wooden spoon remains, a link, smooth as time itself, to a kitchen where the fire never truly dies and the aromas are always just reaching their peak. And as the fire's embers glow low, casting dancing shadows along stone-tiled walls, we ease forward into the next quiet corner of medieval cooking. One where bread speaks louder than banquets, and the crust is sometimes the dish. Gently now. Let's see where the story goes. In sleepy medieval towns, where the chimneys puffed like overworked dragons, and the streets smelled faintly of oats, onions, and optimism, there existed a modest but mighty tradition, the humble pie. Not the metaphorical kind, the one you eat when your big plan goes belly up, but the literal, flaky, sometimes questionably filled pies of the Middle Ages. The medieval pie was a peculiar creature. It strutted across the table like royalty, pretending to be a meal and a container all at once. Because back then, pies weren't just tasty, they were practical. Castles weren't known for their abundance of ceramic dishware, and ovens were fickle brutes, either roaring too hot or sulking too cold. So instead of bothering with newfangled ideas like pans, medieval cooks wrapped their food in a thick crust of pastry called a coffin. Yes, you heard that. Right. Pies were once called coffins, fit for both a feast and the quietly dramatic soul of a medieval poet. These pastry coffins weren't always eaten, mind you. The goal wasn't flaky perfection, but structural integrity. Think more along the lines of a medieval Tupperware. If you had a slow-cooked venison stew, some buttered leeks, or a suspiciously hunted goose, you scooped it all into the pastry shell, folded it up, and baked it into a portable pot pie with an existential crisis. Sweet or savory, the pie reigned supreme. Meat was common, boar, beef, mutton, and spicing was generous. Not because they were hiding something, although sometimes they were, but because spice meant wealth. A properly spiced pie was a walking, flaky advertisement that the host had deep pockets and good trade connections. Cloves from Zanzibar, cinnamon from Ceylon, and nutmeg that had probably seen more of the world than many of the pie's eventual eaters. But pies weren't only for the crust. Even peasants had their own variants, hand pies with foraged mushrooms, scraps of seasonal greens, and hefty amounts of luck, especially if the village pig had already had its final squeal of the year and everyone was living off turnips and mint tea stolen from a monastery garden. And speaking of monasteries, monks were no pie-shaming Puritans. They baked with enthusiasm, dousing their pies in honey and lacing them with almonds, dates, or anything that didn't grow icicles during frost season. Some pies functioned as edible religious allegories, symmetrical, layered, orderly, and possibly blessed by a sleepy Benedictine who just confused flour with chalk dust again. Now, perhaps the most theatrical of medieval pies, the rock stars of the medieval pastry world, were those showy banquet pies filled with live birds. Yes, birds. Living, flapping, unhappy birds. Kitchens would prepare a hollow crust, pop the live creatures inside, and serve it up with flair. When sliced, the birds burst out, ideally with neither accident nor lawsuit. This culinary dramatics was less about taste and more about pageantry. A medieval way of saying, I may not have running water, but I have pigeons in a pie, and that's really something. Eventually, the decorative crust began to soften up, both literally and metaphorically. By the late Middle Ages, cooks realized that if the crust was made with finer flour and lard instead of just brute flour and water, you could actually eat it. A brief culinary gasp went up from diners across Europe. The dish is the food, they whispered, giddy with carbs. So, with the rise of edible crust came the pie we might recognize, a golden, fragrant package of filling delight. Savoury or sweet, neatly latticed or haphazard, pies became a staple of kingdom and cottage alike. In Britain, they evolved into meat pies, pork pies, and the socially versatile mince pie. In Italy, the influence morphed into torta rustica, and in France, where everything somehow ends in elegance, pies became carefully coiffed quiches and shimmering tarts. Even now, in our modern kitchens equipped with timers, thermometers, and possibly embarrassing aprons, we owe our buttery, warm, golden brown triumphs to those medieval pie pioneers, to the cook who thought, yes, let's put the stew inside a loaf, and change dinner forever. And as the flames lower in the hearth of this memory, one can almost smell the spiced apple, the touch of fig, the whisper of lamb and herbs wrapped in golden solace. The pie, you see, was more than a meal. It was the edible storybook of the Middle Ages, crust-lined pages filled with flavour, adventure, and the occasional escaped sparrow. As twilight colours the kitchens of yesteryear, let's drift gently toward another culinary curiosity, an invention so surprisingly simple, it's remained virtually unchanged for centuries. It is a truth universally acknowledged, unless you're in a medieval village where truths are more often whispered over mouldy bread and pear wine, that even kings weep when their favourite cheese goes missing. Oh yes, dear listener, the medieval world took its dairy very seriously. Tonight, let us drift gently into the creamy, curdled world of cheese-making in the Middle Ages. Prepare to be neither stirred nor shaken, just mildly aged like a wheel of monastery cheddar. Now, you might think cheese is simply what happens when milk gives up on being fresh. And you're not entirely wrong. But in the Middle Ages, cheese was a miracle. Perhaps not of biblical proportions, but certainly one of culinary salvation. Milk, after all, was noble but fleeting. Left unchecked, it turned sour faster than a jester's joke at a royal funeral. But cheese was survival. Cheese was preservation. Cheese was proof that humans could defeat perishable goods with nothing but rennet and righteous patience. Let's wander inside a medieval cheese room. Often a cool, damp cellar hidden beneath a thatched cottage or behind the monastery's fourth most mysterious door. Inside, rows of earthen shelves hold wheels of glistening goudas and peculiar blue-veined experiments that smell of both heaven and boot leather. It is dark, it is slightly damp, and it smells like history. The cheesemakers of the time were often women, stirring vast cauldrons of milk with carved wooden paddles, whispering prayers to St. Bridget or St. Ursula, depending on whether it was cow's milk or goat's milk, respectively. They knew their craft intimately, passed down across generations, mother to daughter, often to escape the displeasure of husbands who preferred meat over curds. The monasteries, too, became sanctuaries of serious cheese science. Monks, those ever-patient custodians of celestial bureaucracy, treated cheese-making as part liturgy, part chemistry, and part devout snack production. Now, before you conjure up a roaring fire and a stovetop, let me gently remind you, this was the 13th century. Temperature control was more divine intervention than dial selection. Fires were either too hot or not hot at all. Smoke was a seasoning, and timing was left to instinct, or the third cock's crow, whichever came first. Yet these noble souls managed to develop cheese so good, we're still nibbling at their legacy in supermarkets today. Parmesan, or as medieval Italians knew it, Parmigiano Reggiano, was recorded as early as the 13th century, already hard enough to endure travel, time, or a brief siege. In fact, hard cheeses were ideal for long pilgrimages. Many a weary traveller found themselves comforted not by divine visions or roadside relics, but by a humble chunk of sheep's milk pecorino tucked under their belt, next to a rather sceptical sausage. In Normandy and parts of what we now call Switzerland, soft cheeses began their reign, silky, runny concoctions that would later evolve into camembert and gruyere, though the latter wasn't formally named until later. Cheese even found itself implicated in diplomacy. Noble gifts, sealed in wax cloth and tied with ribbon, were offered to seal treaties, arrange marriages, or at least encourage neighbours not to send raiding parties before breakfast. But cheese was not for all palates. In some corners of the church, cheese was considered suspicious, a food too carnal, too alchemical. After all, it turned liquids into solids. One minute you had milk, the next, you had something that squeaked when you bit into it. Stuff like that could get you excommunicated on a slow Tuesday. Some believed cheese might inflame passions, or worse, digestion. It was occasionally banned during Lent, unless you had the right connections and an easily persuaded priest. Still, for the peasants and patricians alike, cheese was joy. Paired with bread and ale, it formed the holy trinity of please, let this meal not be gruel again. And on feast days, picture great wheels cracked open, with knives the size of small swords, chunks passed around as if they were rubies mined straight from the cow. Even today, our love of cheese lingers, quietly medieval in its ceremony, sprouted from fireless beginnings, stirred by strong hands, and slowly aged in the mysterious darkness. Whether on a humble cracker or melted in righteous rivers over modern macaroni, each bite carries a parchment's worth of history. As the cellar grows dim and the last wheel is rolled away into the shadows, let's loosen our belts, not just in reverence to cheese, but in gentle preparation to uncover the next layer of medieval flavor, one crumb and curiosity at a time. In the flickering warmth of a medieval hearth, beneath ceiling beams soot-kissed by generations past, something truly magical was afoot. Bread making. Yes, not swordplay or jousts or dramatic invasions, but honest, yeasty bread. By the 14th century, this was the kitchen stage upon which high-stakes drama unfolded daily in both manor and market. Bread wasn't just food. It was a social statement, a health hazard, and sometimes a bit of a lottery ticket, depending on whether your baker had actually cleaned his flour or accidentally added in, say, a few pebbles, or, less charmingly, ground rye infested with a certain fungus. But let's not be overly dramatic just yet. To really appreciate the loaf's lofty status, we must start at its roots, coarse, dark, and a little gritty, courtesy of the humble peasant loaf. This early sourdough cousin was often filled with mixtures that might horrify a modern boulanger. Think bran, rye, barley, and occasionally the sweepings from the mill floor, sometimes even beans. And if kidneys disagreed afterward, well, perhaps it was divine punishment for pride. Meanwhile, nobler households seldom consumed this rugged creation, except perhaps as penance or to demonstrate piety just long enough to impress a bishop. Their bread was lighter, often made with flour so finely sifted it would sigh if you spoke too loudly near it. This was the famed manchet bread, a tender, round loaf made from white flour and dreams, normally reserved for lords, ladies, and clergy with suspiciously soft hands. In noble kitchens, bakers were prized artists, kneading dough like poets with a deadline. They'd rise before dawn, perhaps grumbling poetically, and warm the ovens with kindling and careful curses. Some used wooden paddles longer than their entire arm span to shuffle the bread deep into the heat. occasionally shouting encouragements like, "Don't you dare burn, you beautiful lump of hope." Bread was more than sustenance. It was a utensil. Enter the trencher, a thick slice of stale bread, used quite literally as a plate. By the end of the meal, these edible dishes were soaked in gravy, drippings, and the tales of 1,000 medieval dinners. Trenchers were often given to the poor afterward, a kind gesture made slightly awkward by the fact that they'd served double duty as tableware and, well, sponge. Now, if you're imagining every village in medieval Europe merrily baking away, you may wish to sprinkle on some realism. Bread baking was tightly controlled. In some places, only licensed bakers could use the town ovens, usually owned by the lord naturally, and villagers had to pay a fee to use them. There's nothing like good old-fashioned feudal capitalism to make you appreciate that pitiful-looking toaster oven in your kitchen. Speaking of control, enter the assize of bread, a wonderfully medieval attempt at consumer protection. First enacted in 1266, it regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread. Was your loaf light? The town officials might weigh it. Was the crust too cheeky? You could be fined. Repeated bakers of bad bread risked being shamed in public, or worse, the dreaded pillory. To think, a poorly proofed loaf could earn you a weekend of head-in-hole tomato-dodging excitement. But even with its perils, bread was central to the rhythm of life. Monasteries, those ancient centers of both meditation and fermentation, took bread very seriously. Monks kept detailed records of grain harvests, yeast proportions, and oven temperatures, which sounds suspiciously like early food blogging, minus the filters and sourdough starter names. And while we're whispering about yeast, let's remember medieval bakers didn't have tidy little packets labeled active dry. Instead, they relied on wild fermentation, whatever floated in the air or survived from the last successful bake. This made for some delightful sour loaves and some biological experiments that should have stayed in the bowl. But perhaps most telling of all is how bread wove itself into the language. The upper crust comes, rather unshockingly, from the top portion of baked loaves, often served to the elite. The rest of the loaf, distributed according to rank, of course. And thus, even bread observed the pecking order. So the next time you brush the flour from your palms or grumble over a less than springy baguette, know that you stroke the ghost of a medieval tradition each time you bake or break bread. From hand-kneaded sacrifices to law-protected crusts, the art of bread ties our modern kitchens to centuries of crumb-conscious cooks. Now, let's tilt our gaze toward the next time-honored tradition, one that begins not with yeast, but with something sweeter. Perhaps a spoonful of honey or a twist of spiced wine. Picture this: a room dimly lit by flickering tallow candles, the heavy scent of spices lingering in the air, and a blissfully overstuffed nobleman leaning back with the distinct satisfaction of someone who's just devoured half a swan. Welcome to the after-dinner delights of the medieval world, an era that took its desserts somewhat seriously, though with creative liberties that might perplex your modern sweet tooth. Yes, we've reached the part of our medieval feast that twinkles like sugar on a marzipan hedgehog, the subtle, mysterious, and occasionally questionable joys of dessert. And while they hadn't yet mastered the creme brulee torch, they were already plotting to seduce palates with sweetness and spectacle. Unlike today's towering sponge-layered birthday cakes or Instagrammable macarons, medieval desserts weren't everyday treats. Sugar wasn't just rare. It was basically alchemy by the pound, imported all the way from the East, often via Venetian traders who may or may not have added a few creative surcharges along the way. sugar in medieval Europe was as much prestige as palate pleaser. Think less, pass the sprinkle jar, and more, behold this miraculous treasure from lands unknown. Naturally, where there's limited supply, there's heightened imagination. And so, medieval kitchens came up with the subtlety, a showy dessert that, despite its name, was anything but subtle. Picture an edible scene carved from almond, paste, sugar, and ambition. A castle complete with turrets, a knight on horseback slaying a marzipan dragon, or an entire choir of sugar pigeons mid-hymn. These sugary sculptures were constructed at such lavish feasts that even the host might wonder if the dessert was safe to eat, or a new religious icon. Meant to dazzle and entertain between courses, they weren't just desserts. They were edible theatre. You could say they were the medieval version of, wait, don't eat that yet. I need to take a tapestry-worthy painting of it. Now, not every medieval sweet was a dramatic centerpiece. For the less aristocratic folk, desserts were humbler, but no less beloved. Honey was the gateway to sweetness for many, a sticky, golden gift from bees that could be drizzled over porridge, baked into flat cakes, or fermented into a heady mead that meant even your innkeeper's pudding could end with a fuzzy smile. There were also fritters. Yes, the ancestors of your modern donuts. Monasteries were surprisingly prolific when it came to deep frying things. Holy men who woke early prayed often, and apparently couldn't resist experimenting with batter. These golden bites, sometimes flavoured with rosewater or spices, were enjoyed hot and sweetened with, you guessed it, more honey. Possibly while a monk looked on proudly, whispering, "In nomine Patris, pass the fritter." Speaking of monasteries, they were also critical in refining, and quite literally distilling food and drink science, preserving ancient Roman recipes, scribbling innovations in thick parchment-bound manuscripts. Monastic societies helped transition European palates from the earthy simplicity of pottage to the more refined indulgences of spiced wines and fruited wafers. They even recorded dessert-like concoctions involving dried fruits, nuts, and the occasional stolen sprinkle of cinnamon, perhaps smuggled in from a particularly generous tithe. Now for those wondering how we get from marzipan nights to modern pudding, let's make a curious detour to the popular medieval treat known as blancmange. Originally from Arabic influences, blancmange was a sort of sweetish chicken pudding, thickened with rice and almond milk. Wait, chicken? In your dessert? Oh yes, because why not combine your main dish and your postscript into one gelatinous, well-intentioned bowl? Over time, the meat was elbowed out, likely by the same person who made eye contact with it and said, maybe, no. Eventually, blancmange transformed into the sweet milk-based puddings we recognize today. But its early, poultry-infused versions still echo faintly down the culinary corridors of history, like a ghost wave from a faraway Turkey. What's perhaps most delightful, or at the very least disarming, is how the medieval world viewed food as layered experience, spiritual, social, and sensory. To top off a feast not only with flavour but with wonder was as important as the bread and broth. Before it, dessert was a final flourish, a gentle and gilded exhale at the end of a heavy, roast-laden day. So next time you peel back the lid on a sleepy cup of vanilla pudding, think of the centuries behind that silky spoonful, all the honey-drizzled fritters, powdered sugar castles, and hiccupy monks that paved the way. And in the warmth of that thought, as the fire crackles low and the last flake of almond falls to parchment, one might wonder, what role did drinks play in wrapping up the medieval meal? Was it all just mead and mystery? Let's lean in toward the goblet and find out. If you were to tiptoe into a medieval kitchen just before dawn, you wouldn't find the clatter of cast iron pots or the cheerful hummings of a peasant cook in a smudged apron. No. Instead, you might be met with the gentle hiss of embers, the soft wheezing of a bellows, and a suspiciously loud chicken in an inconvenient corner of the room. That chicken should have been dinner yesterday. Alas, cooking in the Middle Ages was an affair of patience, smoke, and possibly minor burns. And one particular rhythm in this culinary symphony that quietly echoes through to modern-day kitchens, often without anyone noticing, is the simple but profound act of the morning meal, the preparation of what the English quaintly called breaking one's fast. Yes, breakfast. That humble, unglamorous repast now dominated by cereal boxes and international debates over the best way to poach an egg. But in medieval times, breakfast was a topic of some controversy. Among the more well-fed classes, the aristocracy, the clergy, and their cats, breakfast was frowned upon, particularly by the church, whose early teachings suggested that any eating before noon was slightly sinful, if not wildly decadent. Only the weak-kneed bacon before compline, someone surely muttered while getting dressed in itchy wool robes. It was believed that a person of virtue could hold their stomach until midday, sipping only on morning prayers and the quiet, nutritious guilt of their ancestors. However, among peasants, the morning meal was less of a moral debate and more of a practical necessity. After all, balance sheets don't hoe themselves, and if you've ever tried to plough a frozen field on an empty stomach, well, you'd have come back very appreciative of a crust of rye and a steaming mug of weak beer. Ah yes, morning beer. In a twist that will delight fans of brunch, low-alcohol ale was a perfectly acceptable breakfast beverage in many households, including those run by monks. Children, adults, livestock, all were given a taste. To be clear, it wasn't exactly Oktoberfest before sunrise. The beer was called small beer and had less alcohol than a banana that's gone off. And yet, it served its purpose. It hydrated and nourished, which was more than could be said for most of the water. Water, back then, was regarded with suspicion, and quite rightly. If it's not moving, it's guilty, they basically assumed. As for the food itself, breakfast tended to be a simple affair. Bread made from whatever grain was available, barley, rye, or if you were very lucky, wheat, could be slathered in dripping. That's rendered animal fat. For those not born into the glory ages of medieval peasanthood, sometimes there'd be cheese, or onions, or porridge thick enough to be used in masonry. But occasionally, on feast days and festivals, or when visitors came, or, say, when someone in the manor did something heroic like catching 2 rats in 1 hour, breakfasts would grow in size and enthusiasm. You might even see fish, and always that trusty brew. What survived from those humble meals to our modern tables? Well, porridge, my curious insomniac, has never left us. It just rebranded impressively. In medieval times, it was often oat-based, simmered until it could deflect arrows. Today, it's overnight oats in a mason jar, topped with goji berries and existential dread. Aal for breakfast may have fallen slightly out of favour, depending on one's proximity to Williamsburg or Oktoberfest. But the idea of morning beverages bringing comfort and vitality is alive and frothy. Just replace the ale with coffee, and there you are. Medieval hydration, filtered twice and served in a reusable cup. Even the idea of a structured eating time each morning, however modest, is rooted in peasant routines, a need to fuel the body before labour, even if it meant rising in the dark, navigating your way to the hearth, and possibly getting pecked by that same chicken from earlier. Breakfast might not have enjoyed philosophical prestige back then, but its stubborn practicality made it endure. Long before avocado toast, long before English muffins, even before Waffle House, there was crusty bread, a splash of ale, and a quiet resolve to make it through another dawn without collapsing in one's field. Now, as the medieval hearth flames quietly dim, and the chickens, bless them, finally stop plotting, we're ready to drift softly onward, where sweets, spices, and surprise guests at supper await in the cobbled corridors of culinary time. In the heart of the medieval kitchen, nestled between bubbling cauldrons and the stern supervision of a cook, wielding a ladle like a scepter, a quiet revolution was simmering, one that still shapes how we plate our meals today. No, not the invention of Tupperware, which, alas, was several centuries and a few polymers away, but the ancient art of food presentation. Yes, even in the dimly lit corners of 13th century kitchens, where soot danced with the steam and the fire crackled with culinary anticipation, there was surprising attention paid to how food looked, because even then we ate with our eyes first, followed closely by our hands, always our hands. Now imagine this, a grand feast in a noble hall, banners fluttering gently in the rafters, harp, music floating through the air, and guests reclining on benches in varying states of belt strain. A peacock glides in, feathers fan dramatically. And no, it's not alive. It's been thoroughly roasted, then artfully redressed in its own feathers. Yes, in a truly medieval twist on dinner and theatre, the bird was cooked and recostumed for the table. One part cuisine, one part taxidermy, and entirely over the top. This, dear listener, was called entremet, dishes served between courses, often with more flair than flavour. Picture illuminated jellies shaped like castles, pies that exploded with songbirds, seriously, and entire roast boars decorated with gilded tusks and apple-stuffed snouts. These weren't just meals, they were edible declarations of wealth, power, and one's willingness to fuss with poultry. But not all displays of culinary panache were for spectacle alone. The way food was arranged had deeply practical roots. Long before the salad spinner or layered parfait came to be, medieval cooks understood that presentation played a role in anticipation and enjoyment. A cook arranging pottage, a sort of medieval stew, chalk soup hybrid, would layer the ingredients intentionally with meats and vegetables displayed at the surface to showcase their richness. A visual menu of what lay beneath the broth, and a not so subtle hint of status. Even commoners got in on the action. On feast days, families might arrange breads, cheeses, and fruits in pleasing formations, especially if neighbours were around. A shared table was part sustenance, part pride display, part subtle competition to see who had the plumpest apples. There may not have been Instagram stories, but the desire to dazzle remains strikingly familiar. Now here's where the sleepy thread of history gently weaves back into your modern plate. That parsley lovingly tucked next to your sandwich, a humble heir to the Ghani tradition. The symmetrical arrangement of your sushi, a nod to the old world idea that beauty on a plate is a form of respect. For the guest, for the ingredients, for the act of nourishment itself. And while we may no longer use live birds to soundtrack our meat pies, and thank goodness for that, the impulse to plate with purpose endures. A drizzle of sauce along a white plate echoes the same spirit of intention that medieval cooks practiced with saffron-rich glazes and bread trenchers cut just so. Even your morning avocado toast, if styled just right, is technically an entremet. Michelangelo had marble. You have sourdough. It might also surprise you to learn that some of the earliest cookbooks featured not only recipes, but entire chapters on how food should be arranged. The form of curry, a 14th century English collection of recipes compiled by royal cooks, made suggestions not just on how to cook, but also how to serve, with all the nudging subtlety of a mother-in-law during a wedding banquet. You see, in those days, the way food appeared said as much about its maker as the flavor. Artistry and edibility danced a delicate medieval waltz. So tonight, if you're drifting off beside a plate of leftovers in the fridge you fully intend to ignore until tomorrow, consider this. Even your reheated pizza, arranged carelessly on a chipped plate, sits atop centuries of culinary lineage. You may not cloak it in feathers or serenade it with harpists, but your choice to reheat, not discard, is its own small ritual of reverence. Somewhere out there, a medieval cook just nodded in quiet approval. And as the feast winds down and the candles burn low, another tradition gently twinkles on the horizon, one that marked the end of any great medieval meal, the final sip, the last morsel, and the hush that follows. Like the quiet that brings us to our next course, where even the spices have stories to whisper. As dusk gently stretched its shadowy fingers across medieval villages, a curious aroma often swept through the cobbled lanes, an unmistakable scent of something baking, something festive, something that smelled faintly of a celebration being invented. That, dear dreamer, was the smell of spice. And if you're still not asleep, you might wish to know how medieval people, often thought of as unbathed and gloomy, were actually obsessed with spices like a 14th century version of gourmet foodies, only with more chainmail and fewer Michelin stars. You see, in the Middle Ages, spices were the medieval equivalent of emojis, able to completely change the meaning of anything. A roast chicken, add saffron, and suddenly it's a feast. Porridge, a pinch of cinnamon, and it's breakfast for royalty. Spices didn't just flavor food, they announced social status louder than a peacock with a trumpet. Take pepper, for instance. It was so valuable that it was measured out with the precision of a modern-day gemstone appraisal. A small sack of pepper might be used to pay rent. Yes, actual residential rent, which gives new meaning to the phrase spicy real estate market. Now, before you imagine every medieval pantry bursting with little glass jars like a Tudor version of a health food store, know that spices were expensive, exquisite, and not universally available. Most were imported with great fuss from lands far away, India, the Middle East, and the fabled islands known as the Spice Islands, which were considered so precious they almost caused more wars than religion. Nearly. Merchants known as pepperers began organizing into guilds. These weren't practitioners of pointless seasoning, but respected men who wore long robes and handled exotic goods like nutmeg, cloves, and cardamom. They were the original influencers of taste. If a pepperer told you your stew lacked heat, you probably added a second mortgage just to afford a few extra grains. Among the most treasured were saffron and cinnamon. Saffron, bright as dragon's gold and harvested, quite romantically, from the crocus flower, had to be picked by hand. Thousands of tiny red stigmas per ounce. It turned food yellow in the most luxurious way and was said to promote vitality, joy, and, if legends are to be trusted, the occasional bout of romantic recklessness. Cinnamon, meanwhile, came wrapped in myth and bark. Christopher Columbus even failed at one of his voyages because he thought he had found true cinnamon, when in fact, he'd only stumbled upon a relative, an unmistakable baking mix-up. The royal courts of Europe, of course, hoarded spices like crows collect shiny things. Banquets became theatrical acts of spice flamboyance. Imagine a feasting table ablaze with the heady perfume of clove-studded meats, ginger-thickened sauces, and rosewater-soaked desserts, all served on trenchers of stale bread destined to be either compost or church donations. Even salt, now casually dismissed as "pass me that shaker," was a serious business. The term "above the salt" came to describe someone important enough to sit nearer to the salt cellar, the social equivalent of sitting near the host at a dinner party, or being followed back by a celebrity on medieval Twitter. But perhaps the coziest, dreamiest part of this spice story is how it connects directly to that warm mug of mulled wine or gingerbread cookie you might enjoy during the holidays. Many of our festive spice blends today, cinnamon, nutmeg, star anise, if you're fancy, cloves, carry the fragrant DNA of medieval culinary experiments. When monks weren't busy copying scripture or dodging Viking raids, they were often stirring sweet concoctions spiked with warming spices, sold in monasteries as both medicine and merriment. Even more humbly, some households mixed spices into their breads and buns, laying the foundation for a rather unsuspecting modern marvel, the hot cross bun. That soft, golden, gently spiced morsel that appears every spring carries the whisper of 1,000 medieval kitchens, where cooks once grated nutmeg into dough and dusted flour into hearts. In truth, the Middle Ages were never quite as bland as modern myths suggest. Beneath their sooty stone hearths and flickering torches, there lingered the perfume of global trade, the quiet diplomacy of merchants, and dreams of distant lands where spices grew like secrets on trees. And as the night deepens and the scent of parchment and cinnamon fades into the hush of old kitchens, we turn our gaze to the earliest medieval recipe ever written down. Not by a famous chef, but by a monk with a taste for stews and a quill dipped in broth. Somewhere between the clatter of pewter spoons and the slow bubbling of cauldrons hung on iron hooks lies the curious tale of how medieval people both feared and revered spice. No, not the gossip kind, though that too had a strong aftertaste, but the actual spices: pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and the ever-dramatic saffron, which cost more per ounce than a small medieval cow. To the modern kitchen, black pepper is just what we twist absent-mindedly over our scrambled eggs. But back in the Middle Ages, peppercorns were practically currency, literal coinage in spicy disguise. In fact, rent could be paid in pepper. You could settle debts with it. There are receipts from as early as the 10th century detailing how many ounces of pepper were needed to clear a bishop's estate taxes. Yes, bishops had estate taxes. The Lord's work, apparently, involved a fair amount of bookkeeping and seasoning. Medieval spice cabinets, though they weren't really cabinets so much as lockboxes, were locked tighter than a dragon's vault, because with spices came not only wealth, but rumour, suspicion, and miles of spice-inspired tall tales. One recurring legend was that cinnamon was fished from rivers guarded by ferocious birds, or collected from nest-building trees by stealing it with trickery and ox legs. Truly, they said you dangled meat, and the birds would build nests with sticks, and the meat, leaving the cinnamon accessible. Entire scrolls were written about spice harvests in lands no European had ever visited. Spices were magical by nature, because their reality was utterly unknowable. And even though these tales were, shall we say, creatively sourced, the symbolic power of spices stuck. They denoted sophistication, reach, and knowledge of the wider world, though wider world, in this case, meant anything beyond the next muddy village. But here's the gentle marvel. This obsession wasn't purely about flavor. People weren't throwing cloves into their stews because they had discerning palates trained on early notions of cuisine. No, it was medicinal, claimed to purify the blood, to warm a cold stomach. In the humorous theory of the body, those four squishy humors that needed balancing like a wonky medieval waltz, spice had a starring role. Pepper was hot and dry. Saffron, even hotter. You didn't just taste your meal, your gallbladder did too, and it wasn't limited to the rich. Well, mostly, but not entirely. During feast days, festivals, or the unexpected death of a noble relative, someone always managed to sneak into a dish a pinch of the good stuff. A winter stew with 3 grains of clove was like wearing velvet to a hay bale wedding. It made a statement. Spices meant celebration, or at least the illusion of it. And so, peasants' pottage might get a dignified splash of spice, borrowed, gifted, or liberated from the manor kitchen, under the distracted eye of a scullery maid who wanted none of the blame. And here's the sleepy twist. Those very same flavors, cinnamon over porridge, nutmeg in warm cider, cardamom in sweet buns, have wormed their way into our holidays and comfort rituals. The cinnamon roll you eat by the fire, the chai that makes your toes feel wrapped in a quilt, those are not modern fads. They are ancient, smuggled luxuries turned nostalgic staples. Even the concept of the spice, blend, the mix and muddle, a little of this and a touch of that, comes from cookbooks that predate your grandmother's 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 grandmother. In a 14th century recipe, one might find instructions to throw in 4 sorts of powder, with directions no more specific than that. The mood was vibes-based cooking. Measurements were fluid. Add until you can't afford more was an acceptable approach. And still, the spice trade spurred entire empires to rise and fall. Oceans were crossed, foods transformed, palates expanded, and through the aromatic haze of cloves and cinnamon, people began to imagine a world more connected, if only by the tingly sense that your soup might now be mildly dangerous and exciting. We often think of exploration as driven by gold or land, but sometimes it was powered by ginger. There's something rather poetic in that, don't you think? That the quiet longing for warmth on the tongue could inspire entire voyages, seasick, sailors and elaborate trade agreements hashed out atop splintered trestle tables. The next time you sip something sweet and warming and wonder why it tastes like memories and Middle Earth, just remember, spice is ancient, indulgent, and ever so slightly mischievous. Now, as evening deepens and the kitchen fire dims to a sleepy glow, we'll wander next into a tradition so persistent it's likely sitting in your pantry right now, wearing a paper label and pretending not to be medieval at all. Back in the quiet corners of late medieval Europe, just as the cows were being brought in, and supper was clattering into bowls of groaning porridge and dark stews, an unassuming food revolution was bubbling beneath the lids of bubbling pots. The artful, curious inclusion of spices. Yes, spices. Those tiny flavor grenades that launched 1,000 grocery list entries and at least 1 or 2 minor global empires. But in the 1300s, they were a sure sign you were either incredibly wealthy, mildly ostentatious, or deeply committed to impressing someone with a palate as jaded as the court jester's jokes. To sleepy modern eyes, it may seem odd that what we now sprinkle carelessly onto our takeout pizza could once equal the cost of a good horse. But in the Middle Ages, black pepper was more than seasoning. It was currency, prestige, and possibly a bragging right. depending on how loudly you shouted your dinner orders. A handful of cloves might pay your rent. A pouch of saffron could practically buy you a keep with a moderately drafty tower. The trade routes bringing spices from the east, pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, were long, winding, and fraught with exactly the kind of dangerous adventures that only bored Venetian merchants seemed enthusiastic about. Ships carried exotic ingredients past storms, pirates, and the occasional stowaway weasel. And when those spices appeared on medieval plates, often floating atop almond milk-based sauces in otherwise beige feasts, they were more about social climbing than actual flavor enhancement. Still, our medieval chefs, those pointy-hatted miracle workers crouched beside open hearths and sweating into their tunics, weren't just hoarding spices to show off. They were trying sincerely to make food, not boring. This was a time before refrigeration or year-round avocado availability. Meat was often more aged than distinguished. Vegetables were tired by mid-January, and beer was safer to drink than water, though possibly more dangerous if you had a lute to play that evening. So adding a pinch of spice wasn't just culinary flair, it was survival, with style. Of course, medieval cookbooks weren't exactly beach reads. Many were more aspirational than practical, handwritten tomes in Latin or courtly French, passed down like sacred texts. They listed recipes for dishes with delightfully enigmatic names such as blanc mange and tarte de brie, often requiring ingredients available only if you personally knew a Venetian sea captain or lived next door to a monastery with connections. Even so, these manuscripts, strange and smeared with grease or goose quill ink, give us clues into a world where cinnamon and parsley got top billing on a meat pie. Interestingly, and here's a fact you might gently hum to yourself as you drift to dreamland, spices didn't solely belong to the rich. Much like TikTok dances today, flavor trends trickled downward. Local apothecaries sold ground pepper and powdered ginger in thumb-smudged jars, while spice merchants set up in bustling market squares, hawking their fragrant wares beside sellers of eels, onions, and the occasional suspicious-looking wheel of cheese. Spices also crept into the medicinal world, slinking seamlessly from kitchen to sick room. A sprinkle of nutmeg might warm the stomach. A decoction of cinnamon soothed coughs. Licorice root, which tastes oddly like regret and fennel, was actual medicine, still is in some circles. In a time before antibiotics, people often treated dinner like a doctor's appointment, sometimes unsuccessfully, especially if said dinner was mostly ale and suspect pork. But while royalty could drown its roasted swan in saffron sauce, peasants had to be a bit more imaginative. A turnip stew may not change the world, but toss in a pinch of caraway or a scrap of dried sage, and suddenly you're the Gordon Ramsay of the Shire, hopefully with fewer television appearances. Over time, even modest tables began to adopt these once exotic touches, softening hard bread with spice-infused oils, or baking sweet cakes with hints of cinnamon saved up for a festival day. Fast forward to your modern kitchen, where cinnamon lives on your oatmeal, pepper grinds over your eggs, and ginger sneaks into your tea bag. And you're indulging in a flavor legacy stretching back to ships and spice caravans, court feasts, and market rhymes. Medieval cooks may not have had microwaves or marinara, but their love for flavor bloomed bold and bright, a fragrant resistance against the bland, the bleak, and the boiled. And so, as the imaginary medieval fire crackles low, and your eyes flutter gently beneath thoughts of cloves and cardamom, let us wander toward the next quiet tradition, The curious story of communal bread ovens and how sharing heat shared hearts. There are few things so exquisitely universal as the humble ritual of sitting with a warm cup in the quiet of early morning or late evening. Whether it's a foamy cappuccino fortified with oat milk, an existential dread, or a teacup of something herbal that tastes suspiciously like lawn clippings, most modern folk engage in some kind of hot beverage ceremony. And wouldn't you know, it's one more sip of medieval tradition hiding in plain sight. Back in the Middle Ages, when trousers were optional and basic hygiene was considered edgy, people didn't just drink to slake thirst. No, the act of drinking was a full-fledged social, spiritual, and often medicinal experience. Let's talk about them. Not the trousers, the drinks. Water, that fundamental elixir of life, was a bit precarious in medieval Europe. You see, it had this unfortunate habit of being laced with a medley of charming microorganisms, making every sip a potential intestinal adventure. So folks did what any sane person would do. They turned to booze. Not the kinds of booze that get you invited to rooftop bars in Brooklyn, mind you. No, this was small beer, a watery, mildly alcoholic beverage that children and peasants consumed all day, every day. Sometimes it was so weak, you'd need to drink an entire pail just to catch a buzz, which might explain the robust medieval bladder capacity. Monasteries, those ancient bastions of both prayer and fermentation, took things up a notch. Monks were the caffeine-fueled baristas of early Europe, brewing beers and meads with surprising complexity. Their secret ingredient, silence and fasting. Turns out, if you live mostly on prayer, barley, and deeply suppressed grievances, you can really lean into your craft. But not all warm drinks came in pint mugs. Let's turn our gaze eastward, somewhere between a cathedral and a camellia bush, where tea began to weave its way into European hearts. Long before the aristocracy of Britain held pinky fingers aloft in saucer-eyed reverence, tea had reached Western ports via complex trade routes through the Middle East and Venice. It was luxurious, rare, and suspiciously foreign. A leaf with power enough to tingle the palate and, more notably, impress your guests. Spices, too, found their way into the medieval mug. Mulled wine, or as it might have been whispered near a candlelit cloakroom, Ippocras, was the drink of celebration. Red wine infused with cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, and cloves, then sweetened with honey or sugar if you were fabulously wealthy or had questionable dental priorities. And don't worry, medieval dental hygiene was already, well, let's say, opt-in. We mustn't forget posset, which sounds like a small woodland creature but is, in fact, a historical bedtime beverage. Posset was a steamy concoction of milk curdled with wine or ale, spiced and sweetened, and served to the sick, the chilly, or the royally bored. It was sort of like a lactose-fueled NyQuil, made right in the comfort of your great hall. And then came the rise of the tremble-inducing triumvirate: coffee, tea, and chocolate, sometimes referred to as the drinks that changed Europe. Coffee, after a perky entrance from the Ottoman Empire, first made waves in Venice in the early 1600s. But even before that, whispers of its energizing powers had stirred moral debates, particularly around how many religious opinions one could have after 3 cups on an empty stomach. Chocolate, yes, even that rich, decadent, velvet-smooth seducer was first enjoyed as a drink. The Aztecs and Maya had already mastered the sacred cacao, whisked with spices and chilies, long before European explorers stumbled in with their nautical maps and too tight hose. When it made its splashy debut in European courts, People didn't eat it in bars. They sipped it in goblets. Hot, frothy, and dangerously addictive. Much like court intrigue itself. But let's not rush past the most holy of medieval beverage traditions. Feasting toasts. If you were at a grand banquet and managed to survive both the eels and the host's poetry, you'd raise a goblet to someone's health. The word toast quite literally comes from the practice of putting spiced or burned bread in wine to absorb some acidity, and possibly out of sheer boredom. To your health, they'd cry, ritualizing togetherness with every little sip of liquid hospitality. So there you have it. The next time you cradle your mocha, turmeric latte with oat milk and whisper sweet grievances into its steam, know that you walk in the well-sold footsteps of monks, queens, sailors, and sleep-deprived scribes, with a beverage that, much like history, gets better the longer you steep in it. And speaking of things best left to simmer, let's gently ladle our thoughts into quieter corners where another taste of medieval tradition is already stirring. There's something undeniably charming, perhaps even a little absurd, about how seriously medieval people took table manners. Not just the forks and spoons part, mind you. We'll get to that. As promised, no historical cutlery left behind. I'm talking about the pre-dinner rituals. Before the meal even began, guests would often be ushered to a basin for hand washing, as if about to perform surgery or patch up a tapestry. You'd think they were about to conduct a sacred rite, not bite into a slightly undercooked pie. The hand-washing custom wasn't just about hygiene. It was an elegant performance, and at the grander tables, this was done with scented water poured from ornate jugs, with attendants offering linen towels embroidered with fleur-de-lis or the family goat. It served multiple purposes: cleansing the hands, purifying the spirit, and importantly, signaling to everyone that you hadn't recently been handling pigs in the courtyard. Now, while the aristocrats were busy dabbing lavender water onto their knuckles, the humble folk had their own subtler customs. A communal bowl, often next to the front door, filled with lukewarm water and floating petals from whatever edible flower was still clinging to life in the garden. A small luxury, yes, but appreciated, especially after a day of grain threshing, cheese molding, and goat chasing. Once everyone's hands smelled faintly of time and progress, dinner began with an air of orchestrated calm. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating, little-known medieval table conventions: the idea of the mess. No, not as in a chaotic plate of gravy-drenched everything, but a literal group of people who shared food from common dishes. Typically arranged in groups of 4, a mess was not only your food-sharing unit, it was a social unit, a microcosm of polite cooperation designed to discourage one's natural desire to hoard every single honeyed fig. Medieval etiquette manuals, of which there were many, because apparently people have always needed guidance on how not to be unbearable dinner guests, were full of helpful advice, such as, do not lick your fingers and then dip them back into the shared mustard pot. Do not blow your nose on the tablecloth. Do not scratch your head with your eating knife, even if your thoughts are very itchy. These pointers may seem obvious now, but they must have been urgent in a time when soap was made from ashes and hog fat. And speaking of knives, here's a cozy culinary secret. For quite a long stretch of the Middle Ages, people brought their own knives to dinner. It was a bit like bringing your own wine to a picnic, both mildly arrogant and deeply practical. These knives weren't the delicate steak knives of modern table sets. No, these were sharp, utilitarian blades tucked into sheaths at one's waist, ready to slice a roast, or, if the conversation soured, settle a poetic dispute. Feast fights were rare, but wildly unpleasant for the roasted swans. Forks, meanwhile, were late to the party. To many medieval Europeans, these strange, two-pronged interlopers seemed suspiciously foreign, an affectation of the Byzantines and Venetians. One bishop called them a luciferial luxury, which is possibly the most dramatic way to describe a table utensil. So for a good while, people just scooped and stabbed their way through meals using knives, spoons, and very agile hands. It wasn't until the 11th century or so that forks began elbowing their way in, much to the dismay of those who felt perfectly content poking their meat with steel daggers. And let's not forget the salt cellar, the social nucleus of the medieval table. Sitting near the lord of the manor, the grand salt box was not only a seasoning source, but a social GPS. Guests above the salt were seated closer to power, influence, and presumably warmer pie. Guests below the salt were a bit more expendable, but they did at least get fed. Social distance wasn't a 6-foot rule. It was a condiment placement. The communal nature of these meals, the shared portions, the oddly reverent approach to scented hand water, it all served a greater purpose, to remind people that food was not just sustenance, it was order, ritual, and status, all ladled up in a steaming bowl of lentil pottage. So the next time you reach across the table for the butter dish, with minimally washed fingers and a mild disregard for the rules of cutlery, remember, you're participating in a centuries-old tradition of joyful, if slightly impolite, dining. And somewhere, a medieval etiquette author is rolling in their parchment. But before we close the curtain on this comedically crusty banquet, let's follow the flicker of torchlight down the corridor. There's still one final layer of medieval mystery to uncover. Something sticky, sweet, and wholly symbolic awaits us, just beyond the pantry door. By the flickering hearth of time, let us now pull out a worn wooden chair and ease into one of the most quietly powerful traditions still simmering in our kitchens today, the humble, comforting, almost ceremonial act of broth. Yes, soup, the great bubbling cauldron of all eras, that eternal bowl of warmth that's managed to travel from medieval cook fires to our modern microwaves, only now with fewer turnips and hopefully less hair from the village goat. But let us not rush. In medieval times, broth was more than food. It was an elemental elixir. Before the grand banquets, before the roasts glistening like wet armor, before pies that defied the laws of both gravity and good taste, there was always the simmering pot. Every kitchen, be it peasant's cottage or lordly hall, bore the soft sound of stewing bones, herbs, and the occasional unlucky pheasant. This wasn't just for flavor, it was survival alchemy. Everything went in. Carrot peelings, onion tops, the shifty-looking leek everyone pretended not to notice. If it could be boiled without offending the saints, into the pot it went. Rich with marrow and secrets, broth was the original zero-waste dish. Medieval cooks may not have had Tupperware, but they knew how to stretch a chicken over 4 days and still make you clap for it. In fact, the word potage, which dances somewhere between soup and stew, was a staple on medieval menus. It was thick, hearty, and vaguely mysterious, rather like the monks who often cooked it. You never quite knew what was in it, and that was probably best for everyone involved. Now, while the nobility might have preferred their soups, strained and elegant, what they called clear soups, because apparently clarity was chic even back then, the common folk leaned into texture. Their stews were so chunky they could be wielded as tools, or possibly armor, which was convenient, given that wardrobes were limited and bandits less so. One of the cleverest aspects of medieval soup culture was the perpetual stew, a culinary marvel that modern slow cookers could only dream of becoming one day. The idea was simple: never let the pot go cold. As ingredients were eaten, new ones were added. Bones, roots, meats, whatever the traveller had in their pocket. A tavern could serve the same pot of stew for weeks, months, possibly generations, though that part is speculative / mildly terrifying. Imagine a family recipe not just passed down, but continuously fed like a sourdough starter with trust issues. Flavor deepened with time. There's poetry in that, isn't there? Centuries before TikTok soup hacks, they were inventing dishes that were neither fast nor particularly photogenic. But dear heavens, they fed the soul, and they welcomed everyone in. A pot of soup could stretch to include another mouth at the table, even if the table itself was somewhat optional. And what did they eat it from? That brings us to trenchers, those edible dishes, often made of stale bread, used to sop up soup, pottage and pride. If times were good, you'd eat your trencher. If times were bad, you'd be grateful someone hadn't eaten their own trencher yet, so you could borrow it. In this way, soup and community were deeply intertwined. The act of sharing a pot became symbolic, a quiet ritual of inclusion, and also hunger management. Even today, when we curl up on a sofa with a bowl of chicken noodle or that secret family tomato bisque passed down from your eccentric aunt, who swore by an extra splash of cream and one vaguely alarming chili, we're echoing those ancestral patterns. Maybe not with boar tusks and barley, but with intention, warmth, care, whispered remembrance of something older than we can name. We are all, in some cozy corner of our beings, participants in the great broth continuum. So the next time you pour soup from a can or stir a pot on a weary Tuesday evening, take a moment to honor the hearth that never stopped simmering. And if you hear a distant glorp from the pot, don't worry. It's probably just the spirit of a medieval cook nodding slowly in approval, or perhaps adding more leeks. Tomorrow, the fire will still flicker, the pot will still bubble, and as we tiptoe one spoon deeper into culinary history, we'll find that even the sounds of the kitchen are echoes from medieval halls, softened now by time and sleep. Let us gently close the lid for tonight. There's one more course to come. The fire in the great hall dwindled to a whisper as the coals tucked themselves into glowing slumber, and somewhere in the imagined distance, a lute played a tune so faint it might have been your heartbeat. If you've made it this far, I suspect you've grown quite familiar with the comforting absurdities of medieval cuisine. And now, dear dream-bound friend, let us ease toward the end, not with a bang or a gong of brass, heaven forbid, but with the gentle sigh of an overfed noble loosening his belt beneath a tapestry. Tonight, we arrive at your kitchen table. Yes, yours. That utterly modern sanctuary where pop-up toasters live beside blenders that scream like banshees and fridges illuminate your midnight snack crimes. But believe it or not, nestled among the hum of electricity and the click-click of ceramic mugs, lurk little relics of medieval kitchens long past. First, let's quietly admire the humble spice rack. No, really. You see, back in medieval times, spices were not just sprinkles of flavor. They were the edible equivalent of owning a private castle moat. Black pepper, worth its weight in medieval gold. Cinnamon, a luxury good so revered it might have had a seat at the royal table. Nutmeg, deemed so precious it doubled as both a seasoning and a hypothetical gift for the baby Jesus. Today, we shake cinnamon onto our lattes with wild abandon, But to a 14th century merchant, that's practically financial arson. And as you prepare meals with oil, butter, or, if you're truly fearless, bacon fat, you're tracing the greasy footsteps of history. Medieval cooks, particularly the cunning French, turned the humble sauce into an art form. Their sauce verte, a tangy puree of herbs and breadcrumbs soaked in vinegar, would not be out of place in today's farm-to-table bistro. It's a testament to humanity's long, loving relationship with smothering bland things in delicious goo. Now we must whisper of bread, the loaf, the cornerstone of feasts and famines alike. While your sourdough starter may currently be struggling in the fridge behind the yogurt no one eats, medieval bakers were elbow deep in rye, barley, and oats. And let us not forget the trencher, a slice of bread used as a plate. Practical? Yes. Sanitary? Let's say biodegradable. Once the meal was over, the sauce-soaked trenchers were given to the poor, the dogs, or the servants, occasionally in that order. Today, we call this open-faced toast and charge $12 for it. But perhaps our fondest kitchen tradition, lingering like the scent of onions on a chopping board, is the custom of communal eating. The medieval feast wasn't just a meal, it was a performance. Goblets clinked beneath banners, minstrels hummed questionable tunes, and the food flowed in courses extravagant enough to make Instagram weep. Though your dinner table might be quieter, and your guests less inclined to wear doublets, you're still partaking in the ancient joy of gathering, chewing, chatting, and wondering why someone always forgets to bring dessert. And speaking of desserts, sweet dreams are made of honey, literally. Sugar, during most of the Middle Ages, was medicinal at best and mythical at worst. So medieval cooks relied on honey, dried fruits, and even wine to sweeten their confections. A medieval apple tart or fig pudding would satisfy even the most modern sweet tooth, though the presentation might be more rustic forest elf and less Michelin star plating. Today, your spoonful of jam or your late-night cookie raid owes a courteous nod to some long-gone baker who accidentally invented candied almonds while trying to clean beeswax off a spoon. And finally, we arrive at the warm end of the spoon, where memory and tradition simmer softly. The candles may no longer be made of tallow, and the chickens are less likely to arrive still clucking, but the threads remain. In every family recipe passed down, in every burnt crust salvaged with laughter, in every table where laughter echoes and leftovers await, we find medieval echoes quietly cooking beside us. So sleep now, knowing that your kitchen, your humble domain of tea kettles and toaster mishaps, is a little archive of history. You are, in a delicious way, part steward, part sorcerer, and part peasant with a microwave. The fire is just embers now. The feast has ended. And across the centuries, from castle hearth to your kitchen corner, the meal lingers on. Good night.